Every nation on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the terrifying paradox. If everyone owes money, then who exactly is being owed? The answer isn't what you think. When we trace the chain of creditors, we discover something disturbing. The world owes itself. However, 4 men, across 3 centuries, deliberately engineered this system. They built a trap where debt can never be fully repaid, where interest flows perpetually upward, and where the architects profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why $38 trillion in debt isn't a mistake, but rather a system working perfectly as designed. Chapter 1. William Paterson, 1694. Perpetual debt. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old-fashioned way. They would default if they couldn't pay, and creditors would lose their money. William Paterson changed everything. When King William III of England was desperate for war funding, Paterson proposed a breakthrough mechanism. A group of merchants would lend the government £1.2 million through a new institution, the Bank of England. Here's the ingenious mechanism. This loan would never be repaid in principal. Instead, the government would only pay 8% interest perpetually, guaranteed by Parliament's taxing power. This was the first perpetual public debt in history. Think about what this means. Before Paterson, debt was temporary. You borrowed, you repaid, and the relationship ended. But Paterson inverted the entire concept. The debt itself became permanent, a feature, not a bug. The government would pay interest forever, and the principal would never come due. Now, let me address the obvious counterargument, because I know what you're thinking. Wasn't this actually beneficial? The answer is yes, and that's precisely what makes it so brilliant. Thanks to this mechanism, the British government gained a stable and reliable source of financing for wars and expansion, laying the foundation for the development of a superpower. Britain's empire, its industrial revolution, its dominance of global trade for 2 centuries, all of it was financed through this system of perpetual debt. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Public debt was no longer a problem to be solved, but a feature of the system. More importantly, the Bank of England was granted the right to print money based on this debt. Debt became money. When the government borrowed £1.2 million, the bank didn't hand over gold coins sitting in a vault. They created new money, backed by the government's promise to pay interest forever. This is the first crucial piece of the architecture. Debt doesn't need to be repaid if it generates perpetual interest. The system isn't designed to eliminate debt. It's designed to service it forever. Chapter 2. Nathan Rothschild, 1815. Inescapable debt, systemic risk. By the 1800s, public debt had become common, but markets remained fragmented. Nathan Rothschild industrialized it. He and his 4 brothers established a banking network across Europe, allowing them to buy discounted government bonds and resell them to an international network of investors. Here's Rothschild's innovation. He made public debt liquid and cross-border. Before the Rothschilds, if France issued bonds, they were mostly bought by French investors. If Spain issued bonds, Spanish investors bought them. But the Rothschild network changed the game entirely. They created the first truly international bond market, where Austrian bonds could be sold to British investors, where Prussian bonds could be traded in Frankfurt, where French debt could be held in Naples. Now, there's a dark episode here. We need to acknowledge the alleged manipulation of the British bond market after the Battle of Waterloo. The story goes that Nathan Rothschild received early intelligence of Napoleon's defeat and used that information to manipulate prices before the news became public. Whether this story is entirely accurate or partially mythologized, what matters is the structural reality it represents, information asymmetry, and the concentration of financial power. But let me present the counterargument again, because context matters. Despite their control of information and markets, the Rothschilds created a modern international bond market that helped governments raise capital larger, faster, and cheaper, promoting international commerce. Suddenly, governments could tap into a global pool of capital. This meant more infrastructure, more development, more economic growth. The international gold standard that emerged in the 19th century was, in many ways, facilitated by this integrated bond market. However, here's the crucial architectural innovation. Rothschild transformed debt into a global network. A default by one nation was no longer just a loss for a single creditor. It would collapse the entire international financial system. Debt wasn't just perpetual anymore. It became mandatory to repay. Because if you defaulted, you weren't just hurting one banker in London. You were threatening the entire web of international finance, and that web would ensure you suffered consequences. This is the second piece of architecture. Interconnected debt creates systemic risk, which means no nation can be allowed to truly default without threatening everyone. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Every participant has an incentive to bail out every other participant, not out of generosity, but out of self-preservation. Chapter 3. J.P. Morgan, 1913. Infinite debt. By the early 1900s, America lacked a centralized financial system, leading to repeated crises. After the Panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan and his associates secretly designed a solution: the Federal Reserve. Let me set the scene for you. In 1907, the United States experienced a devastating financial panic. Banks failed, the stock market crashed, and credit dried up. Who saved the system? Not the government, they had no mechanism to do so. It was J.P. Morgan himself, personally orchestrating a private bailout, strong-arming other bankers to contribute capital, essentially acting as the central bank that didn't exist. The embarrassment was clear. The most powerful economy in the world depended on the whims of one private banker. So in 1910, Morgan and a small group of the most powerful financiers in America met secretly at Jekyll Island, Georgia, to design a solution. They spent 10 days drafting the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. Here's the ingenious mechanism. The Fed was designed to appear decentralized and public, but real power remained in the hands of the large Wall Street member banks. The supreme power granted to the Fed was the ability to create money to purchase government bonds to buy debt. Let's be clear about the counterargument, because this is important. The Fed provided a lender of last resort, ending the periodic banking panics and bringing the stability necessary for America to become the #1 economic power. Before the Fed, financial panics occurred roughly every 10 to 15 years. After the Fed, the system had a shock absorber, a mechanism to inject liquidity during crises. But here's what this really meant architecturally. The Fed ensured there would always be infinite demand for government debt. The government never had to stop borrowing or repay the principal. It could roll over debt forever. When Treasury bonds mature, the government simply issues new bonds to pay off the old ones. And if there aren't enough buyers in the market, the Fed can simply create money and buy the bonds itself. This is the third piece of architecture. Debt became infinite. The government gained a buyer of last resort with infinite purchasing power itself through its central bank. The constraint on borrowing shifted from, can we find lenders, to what level of debt service can the economy support without breaking? By 1971, when President Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, this system reached its final form. Money was no longer backed by anything except the government's promise to pay interest on its debt. Debt and money became two sides of the same coin. Every dollar in circulation is someone's debt, either government debt, bank debt, or private debt. Chapter 4. Paul Volcker, 1982. Debt as control. By the 1970s, the debt trap was operating globally. However, when Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, dramatically raised interest rates to fight inflation, developing nations like Mexico and Brazil couldn't service their dollar-denominated debts, which had tripled in interest rate costs. Let me explain what happened. Throughout the 1970s, developing countries had borrowed heavily in dollars, enticed by low interest rates. These loans financed infrastructure, development projects, sometimes just government operations. But these loans had floating interest rates they adjusted based on market conditions. When Volcker raised the federal funds rate from around 8% to over 19% between 1979 and 1981, he wasn't just fighting American inflation. He was tightening the noose on every borrower globally. A Mexican loan that cost $8 million a year in interest suddenly cost $20 million. A Brazilian infrastructure project financed at affordable rates suddenly became unsustainable. By 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make payments. Brazil followed. Argentina followed. The entire developing world faced a debt crisis simultaneously. American banks, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, had lent hundreds of billions to these countries. If these nations defaulted, the largest banks in America would be insolvent. Here's Volcker's ingenious mechanism. He orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF lent these countries money to continue paying interest to the American banks, the primary creditors. Read that again. The IMF lent countries money so they could keep paying American banks. The debt wasn't forgiven. It was transferred and expanded. Now, the counterargument. IMF loans prevented the contagion of a default crisis from Latin America to the global financial system. Volcker prioritized the survival of the system. If major American banks had failed, the ripple effects could have triggered a global depression. The IMF loans, however harsh, prevented a complete collapse. But here's the crucial detail. The loans came with brutal conditions: spending cuts, privatization of state assets, surrender of economic sovereignty. Countries had to open their markets to foreign investment, often selling valuable national assets at fire sale prices. They had to cut social spending, education, healthcare. They had to restructure their entire economies according to a Washington-designed blueprint. And most importantly, the debt was never canceled, only restructured to maintain the flow of interest payments. Countries would spend the next 3 decades, some even longer, servicing these debts. Argentina would default multiple times. Greece would face similar conditions in 2010. The pattern repeats. This is the fourth and final piece of architecture. Debt became a control mechanism. It's not enough that debt is perpetual, interconnected, and infinite. It must also be weaponized. Nations that cannot pay don't get forgiveness. They get conditionality. They surrender sovereignty, they privatize assets, they restructure their societies, and through it all, the interest keeps flowing upward. These 4 architects, each contributing one piece, built the $315 trillion system we have today. And here's the crucial insight. Debt cannot be eliminated, because if global governments paid off all debt, the money supply would collapse, causing super deflation and economic depression. Think about this carefully. In our current monetary system, most money is created through debt. When a bank makes a loan, it creates new money. When a government issues bonds bought by the Fed, it creates new money. If all debt were suddenly repaid, that money would disappear. The economy would seize up. Commerce would halt. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The question isn't whether we can eliminate the $315 trillion in global debt. We can't. The question is, who benefits from this design? Let me show you the money flows. Approximately $1 trillion in annual interest payments on U.S. debt flows from taxpayers working people through the government to institutions holding treasury bonds. Who holds these bonds? Primarily large financial institutions and asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, along with foreign governments and pension funds. This is the largest wealth transfer in history, continuous, structural, and invisible. It's not called a tax, it's called debt service. But the effect is the same. Wealth flows from the many to the few, guaranteed by the government's taxing power, enforced by the architecture these 4 men built. Here's what makes this system so elegant and so insidious. Everyone participates willingly. Investors buy bonds because they're safe. Governments issue bonds because they need funding. Central banks buy bonds to stabilize the economy. Workers pay taxes because it's the law. No one is forced at gunpoint, yet everyone is trapped in the architecture. And when crises hit, and they always do, the system doesn't break. It expands. 2008 financial crisis, the Fed created $4.5 trillion in bought bonds. 2020 pandemic, the Fed created another $5 trillion. Each crisis justifies more debt, which requires more money creation, which devalues existing money, which makes savers poorer and debtors, especially the biggest debtor, the government, relatively better off. This is why inflation is a feature, not a bug. A government with $38 trillion in debt benefits from inflation. If inflation runs at 3% annually, the real value of that debt decreases by over $1 trillion per year. Inflation is a hidden tax that redistributes wealth from savers to debtors, from creditors to borrowers, from the prudent to the leveraged. You cannot change this $315 trillion mechanism, but you can protect yourself. If $38 trillion in debt isn't an accident, but a design, then inflation and currency devaluation are also part of the design. Understanding this architecture changes everything about how you should think about money. Cash loses value by design. Bonds are IOUs from the world's biggest debtor. Stocks are denominated in currencies being deliberately devalued. Real estate is priced in money that's worth less every year. So what do? First, understand that this system has been engineered to transfer wealth from savers to asset holders. The people who built this system hold assets, not cash. They own businesses, real estate, commodities, and yes, government bonds that pay interest. They don't keep wealth in savings accounts watching it erode. Second, recognize that this system is remarkably stable precisely because it's self-reinforcing. The $38 trillion in U.S. debt won't cause collapse tomorrow or next year or probably in our lifetimes. It will simply continue growing, and the currency will continue slowly devaluing, and wealth will continue flowing from workers to asset holders. Third, position yourself accordingly. In the next video, we'll dive deep into 3 specific actions you must take to protect your wealth from this debt tax, including protecting assets with gold and treasury bills, and understanding the risks from the $600 trillion derivatives market. But let me leave you with this thought. The 4 architects we discussed weren't evil geniuses conspiring in dark rooms. They were solving real problems with innovative solutions. William Paterson solved how to finance a government long-term. Nathan Rothschild solved how to create liquid international capital markets. J.P. Morgan solved how to prevent banking panics. Paul Volcker solved how to prevent a global financial collapse. Each solution was rational given the constraints they faced. But solutions have consequences. And when you stack 4 solutions across 3 centuries, you get a system where debt is perpetual, interconnected, infinite, and weaponized. A system where $315 trillion in debt isn't a crisis to be solved, but a feature to be maintained. The question now is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you continue participating in the system blindly, watching your purchasing power erode year after year? Or will you understand the game being played and position yourself accordingly? Let me know your thoughts on these 4 architects in the comments below. Subscribe to Financial Replay to continue decoding the financial secrets they don't teach you in school. Because once you see the architecture, you can never unsee it. And that clarity, that understanding of how the system really works, is the first step toward protecting yourself within it. The debt trap is real, the architecture is documented, the wealth transfer is happening right now, whether you see it or not. The only question remaining is, will you be among those who understand and adapt, or among those who work their entire lives without understanding why their money never seems to be enough? The answer to that question will determine your financial future. I'll see you in the next video, where we get tactical about protecting your wealth in a system designed to extract it.